Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed
Hello, everyone.
our world.
Welcome back to our series on the most important battles in the Civil War. We're looking at Chickamauga and Chattanooga, which is number 8 on our list, even though these are two separate battles, they're often grouped together. In the last episode, we looked at Gettysburg, which many people call the turning point of the Civil War. James and I discussed why that's not exactly the case, because the Civil War is so big and so expansive that you can't really pin it on one event. But one thing we can say that's different is the Confederacy no longer feels this sense of invulnerability that it once did, and perhaps its feelings of invulnerability were what caused the mishaps at Gettysburg in the first place. Anyway, what we're going to see in these two battles is something very interesting. It seems that the Union is plagued by mishaps in the early Civil War. It's moving too slow. Its generals are constantly misestimating. That's not exactly a word, misestimating. Wrongly calculating, wrongly guessing what enemy force numbers are. And could such mishaps happen to the Confederacy? Well, we're going to see what happens here. So, James, let's jump in. What is the strategic situation in the East after Gettysburg?
Okay. We'll wrap up the East, and then we're going to put the East on pause for a while, and we're going to talk about the West for the next several episodes, or at least 2 or 3. As you said, we'd had Gettysburg. Gettysburg was a major Union victory. It was the end of Lee's campaign, his second campaign to try to invade the North. But not a whole lot happens. It wasn't really this big, massive, decisive battle. We're going to see later on that Robert E. Lee and his army are still alive and well. They're alive and kicking, as the phrase says. They're going to be around for quite some more time. They're not packing it in by any means. After the battle, Meade had kind of made a little bit of an effort to harass Lee as he was retreating, but not much. He didn't have a full-fledged pursuit in which he chased after Lee and tried to track him down and destroy him and the army. That was very disappointing to many in the North, and Lincoln too, but then Lincoln finally understands, and we've said this again and again, but it bears repeating, that oftentimes an army is just as exhausted from victory as they are from defeat. You're fighting just as hard. In fact, maybe that's part of why you're winning. So you can't just go down and act as if you've been sleeping well and eating well for a long time. You've got to rest. Both sides have to rest and recover. So Lincoln tells Meade pretty much to hold his position. He was to threaten Lee primarily just by being in a threatening position, not so much by attacking. But don't attack. No major attack is going to occur. And there's going to be a few minor engagements between Lee's and Meade's armies over the next few months, but for the most part, the Virginia front is quiet, and it's going to take a backseat to the West. And things are going to be so quiet, in fact, that the Confederacy is going to be able to shift some troops around. In fact, Jefferson Davis is going to order that 2 divisions in the Army of Northern Virginia, of course, that's Lee's army, he's going to send them west to reinforce the Army of Tennessee, which is led still at this time by General Braxton Bragg. They are camped out in North Georgia, so that's where we're going to pick up the action.
Right, and then that back and forth over which troops go, where do they go, how are they deployed, and whether or not the right choices were made is going to come into play later. But one thing that we left off after Gettysburg is that almost exactly at the same time that the end of Gettysburg happens, there's also the end of the Siege of Vicksburg. So what's happening in the West after Vicksburg?
Okay, so we'll go way out to the Mississippi. As we saw in a previous episode, when Vicksburg fell, not long after that, Port Hudson, Louisiana fell, and that completely put the Mississippi River in Union hands. Grant and other Union leaders are now that they've got control of the Mississippi and they've cut the Confederacy in two, they're not really sure what to do next. There's several options available. One option would be to focus their efforts in the Trans-Mississippi region, meaning across the Mississippi on the west side. Today we would call it the Arklatex. My wife is from Texarkana, and when I'm up there, they're always talking about, this is the best deal in the Arklatex. So that would be Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas.
Wow, that's the first I've heard that. Nice.
Yeah, Arklatex. It's Anyway, it is an important part of the Confederacy. It is kind of on the fringe, but it's important certainly in the sense that they were able to export. Export's not the right word, I guess, because it's the same country, but they are providing a lot of cattle and sugar and other critical supplies for the Confederate armies. Now that's going to be pretty much gone. They could also, the Union Army had the option of concentrating on the Gulf states, maybe going down and working on establishing full control over the state of Mississippi, maybe working on Alabama and gradually working your way toward Georgia, especially on the Gulf Coast. So what are they going to do? Grant and Nathaniel Banks, remember, he's one of these political generals who is pretty modest in his abilities, not much of a general, but he was the hero of Port Hudson. He led the force that captured Port Hudson, the very last Confederate fortress on the Mississippi to fall. Grant and Banks wanted to attack Mobile, Alabama, which was the last major Confederate port left in Confederate hands on the Gulf of Mexico. Halleck is still in command. Well, actually, Halleck is the general-in-chief now. He had replaced General McClellan as the top general in the entire Union Army. He'll hold that for a little while longer. He wanted to focus on the Trans-Mississippi. He thought that Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas could be just completely knocked out of the war. Lincoln agreed with Halleck. He takes Halleck's sides. He wanted Texas's cotton. And there was an international aspect to the problem as well, because France had invaded Mexico. And France had set up a puppet emperor, brought this German guy over and said, "Congratulations, you're now the emperor of Mexico." Oh, it's good work if you can get it. But Lincoln wanted to make sure that France is not going to help the Confederacy by its control over Mexico, bringing in supplies that way through the back door, so to speak. And Lincoln also thought that Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana could be quickly brought back into the Union if federal troops invaded them. There was quite a bit of Union sentiment in parts of these states. There was a little bit in Louisiana. There was quite a bit of Union sentiment in Texas, especially in the Hill Country and in the Dallas area. Well, today we would call it the Metroplex. Back then it wasn't a Metroplex at all, but in northern Texas and in the hills of Arkansas as well. So Lincoln wanted to capitalize on that. So Lincoln decides that Banks is going to lead an invasion of Texas. And by the way, note to listeners, never invade Texas. You always lose.
It's the Russia of the Western Hemisphere.
That's right. As a proud Texan, I'm here to say that it's just not a good idea. But Lincoln didn't understand that. So Banks is under Lincoln's plan. Banks will invade Texas, and Grant will push Joseph Johnston eastward out of Jackson, Mississippi, where he was still, and toward Georgia. Joseph Johnston, we've seen him popping all over the place. He's been, he was at First Bull Run, and he's been here, he's been there. Johnston is now in charge of Confederate forces in the West. He is the top Confederate general. Bragg is under him. Anyway, Grant's job was going to be to eventually clean rebel forces out of West Mississippi to shore up federal control of the Mississippi River, just to make sure we've got firm control, not just of the river itself, but all the land around it. Now, Grant put Sherman in charge of driving Johnston out of Jackson. I know that's confusing. Johnston, Jackson. This is the city of Jackson, Mississippi. And another job that Grant gives to Sherman is to tear up Confederate railroads in Mississippi, which Sherman loves doing that. Sherman loves tearing stuff up. He's, put me in. I want to do it. And Sherman does a great job of this in really destroying the infrastructure of the Confederacy, not completely, but destroying parts of it, critical parts, and making it harder for the Confederates to get supplies from point A to point B, as well as troops. I want to mention one thing in passing. This is going to become a major deal during the March to the Sea later on when we talk about that. But there was a phenomenon called Sherman Neckties. And what happened is the Union troops under Sherman would cut a railroad. They just tear it up, and they would take part of the actual metal that made the rail, and they would heat it up really hot, and then they would twist it around. Sometimes they'd twist them around trees. Other times they would just leave them in place and twist them, or just kind of throw them off to the side. But they kind of looked like neckties, so they called them Sherman neckties. So I think that's kind of a funny little little trivia thing of the war.
Yeah, they're going to be all over the place, the March of the Sea. One question with that. So Sherman is known for this total war, destroying infrastructure. Who's the author of this policy? Is it Grant? Is it someone else?
Well, it's something they just gradually came upon as we talked about during the Vicksburg campaign, how supply lines were so important, how Grant and Sherman at that time followed the traditional military doctrine, if you will, that when you go and invade another country, you bring your supplies with you and you have to keep an open line of supplies. But as Grant and Sherman were marching around through the rich southern countryside, and they saw these big farms and these big plantations with lots of cattle, lots of wheat, lots of fruit and vegetables and all kinds of things, they said, we could have that for ourselves. We don't need to bring supplies. We'll just help ourselves to the local produce, treat it like a restaurant, so to speak. And so it was, I'm not sure that there was a single author of it. It was just something that kind of came to them. Grant and Sherman, I believe, decided on it at about the same time.
All right. Well, there we go. That is the West after Vicksburg. Now, today we conflate a lot of the South together, but back then they were working on a more granular level of what the South was. So another part of the South is Southeast Tennessee and North Georgia, which is another theater. So what's happening in this theater?
All right, this is going to be where a lot of the action is going to be in late 1863. The major Union Army in this theater, we would kind of call this the middle of the country, at least by the standards of that time. It's not the East Coast, but it's not the far west either. It's not over to the Mississippi. We're talking about East Tennessee, North Georgia. The major Union Army is Rosecrans' Army of the Cumberland, and they were stationed just outside of Chattanooga. We saw in a previous episode that prior to that, the Confederates were in Chattanooga and under Bragg, and Rosecrans was north of there. But Rosecrans actually led a brilliant campaign of maneuver, just constantly flanking. Napoleon would have been proud.
There we are, Napoleon.
Yeah, there you go. But y'all don't take a drink because Scott has to say it.
Sorry, everyone.
Oh, you can if you want. But in this Tullahoma campaign, Rosecrans had used deception and used flanking movements and everything except a lot of head-on combat. And he had driven Bragg completely out of Tennessee and into northern Georgia. So he's just south of Chattanooga, but he's in the state of Georgia at this point. Now, Lincoln wanted General Rosecrans to continue driving Bragg southward. He feared that Johnston, who was in Jackson, Mississippi, and Bragg might unite their forces and possibly reconquer part of Tennessee. Lincoln was really eager to have Tennessee brought back into the Union as quickly as possible. So he tells Rosecrans, continue to drive Bragg. Keep doing what you're doing. You're doing a great job. But Rosecrans slows down. Again, one of these plodding Union generals. He had just gotten through with a brilliant campaign, but it's like, he's tired and he doesn't want to move anymore. So he's very, very slow. And it was late July 1863. Oh, man, I just had a Johnny Cash moment. You know the song, The Boy Named Sue?
Of course.
It was Gatlinburg in late July. That just came into my mind. All right. Sorry, listeners.
A bottle of beer. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. It wasn't too far from Gatlinburg, actually. But anyway, so it was late July. Rosecrans begins to move. And at the same time as this, Lincoln had ordered our good old buddy Ambrose Burnside, the man with the epic facial hair who gave his name to sideburns. Burnside, we saw, had been temporarily, or at least for a while, elevated to the command of the Army of the Potomac, but he was an awful commander. But he was pretty good at a lower level of command. So Burnside doesn't get just completely shoved out of the service like McClellan does and some of the other generals. Burnside is back in control of a corps, and he goes, actually, it's kind of a small army, a big corps, and he takes them to Knoxville, Tennessee, which is in northeast Tennessee. And that was, we've talked about this before, that was a big hotbed of unionism. Those people did not want to leave the Union, and they would cause a lot of trouble for Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy. Lincoln wanted to liberate them, and he had been wanting to do this for quite some time. Well, Burnside is successful. He captures the city on September 3rd of 1863. So, and again, we saw that Rosecrans maneuvered Bragg out of Chattanooga.